Are you worried that something that you are doing at the moment could be negatively impacting your child's development? Or maybe you have that creeping feeling that you're missing out on some ingredient that children need to thrive. Or maybe you've been on social media and seen something about something that you're already doing that actually somebody says damages your child's brain or is like a drug for your child. Today we are going to be breaking down 3 things that we know that we have evidence to prove actually does impact children's development. Now, if you are a parent looking to understand more about how your child is developing and what you should be kind of seeing at each age group, you can grab my milestone charts, which are linked below. These walk you through ages 1 until the end of 4, and every kind of milestone that you can expect during those years. You can come and grab those below. So in my experience working as an occupational therapist within preschools and schools and hydrotherapy with hundreds of parents, as well as my experience now working online, running a membership with parents, I see 3 things really come up over and over again of things that parents have maybe heard from social media or from somewhere, or that they just have a kind of feeling about or concern about that they think really does impact their children's development. Now, I want to break down these 3 before we get into things that actually do impact development, because I want you to be able to put them off of your worry list. I want you to take them off of your head before we go into the things that we do really want to be watching out for. So the first one is TV. You may have seen this on social media. You may have seen this even on YouTube. I've seen videos of this. Cocomelon is a drug for your child's brain. There's this big kind of perception that certain types of TV or TV in general is like a drug, and that we are kind of growing our children up in this way that they are addicted to screens, and that this will impact every single area of their development, and that there'll be no way for our children to thrive because we've given them the drug of Cocomelon. So I just wanted to put it out there that there's actually no evidence base for this. There's been no research done on whether Cocomelon specifically acts like a drug for your children. And in fact, generally speaking, the only implications that we see when it comes to TV time or screen time around attention or around development are associated differences. So let's just break down what that means, right? There's a difference between something actually causing a problem and something that when we see that there is this problem, we can look back and notice that there are common factors with people that have this issue. So when it comes to screen time, when children are watching more than 7 hours of screen time, we may see some association here with a difficulty concentrating. And that feels like, as a parent, I don't know, I feel like this feels like pretty logical, right? Like if you yourself are watching 7 hours of screen time a day, or even if you were in front of your computer for 7 hours a day, you're going to feel like not great, right? Within your body. You're going to feel this kind of built up stress or need to kind of shake off all of that sitting, which is pretty natural. We know that for children under 3, and this is like a general recommendation from most pediatric organizations, we want to be limiting or not having screen time at all for children under 3. The reason is not necessarily that it's a drug, it's because they don't have the conceptual basis for how to understand TV. And on top of that, it is taking time away from all of the things that children under the age of 3 need to be filling their time with to support their development. But we can rest assured that if our child has watched Cocomelon once or twice, they have not damaged their brains. So there's no real evidence base there. The next one is about sending our children to preschool or daycare. I can really relate to this because it was something that I struggled with as well. I think if you're interested in this topic, like the question is, does sending your child to an early childhood education center or to a playgroup or a daycare or a preschool, does it damage their development because they're not around you? And there's this book, Crib Sheet by Emily Oster. She breaks down the research in this book really well in terms of what we do know about childcare and the research that we have around that. But I'll tell you the crib note, well, this is called Crib Sheet, but I'll tell you the crib notes on this concept and different research papers that have looked into this is that there isn't any notable difference in research around whether a child goes to daycare or whether they stay at home. There isn't any notable difference around their overall child development. What we do know is that the home environment seems in research more important than the school or daycare or center environment. So we want to be putting kind of the onus on ourselves as well, that while they may be in daycare or preschool, when they get home, that time that we're with our children is actually really, really important. And the quality of interactions that they're having with us as the parents is very, very influential on their overall development. But I think that if you are kind of weighing up the pros and cons, of course, what research says is like one part of the whole picture of what works best for our families. So just because research says that it doesn't harm children's development, it doesn't necessarily mean that going to a playgroup or a preschool or a daycare is the best decision for your specific family. But if this is the decision that you made and this is what works best for your family, you can definitely rest assured that there is no evidence base to say that this is damaging your child's holistic development. And the third one that I see parents saying to me over and over again, and it really is one that kind of like, I just feel really sad that this information is really perpetuated, is that if you've shouted at your child even once, you've somehow damaged their brain. Now, we have the ability to raise our voices in just like we have the ability to feel pain on our skin. Like sometimes we need to be able to raise our voice. I've had situations where my children have like run into the road. We need to be able to show them that there's a difference, right? And that doesn't damage their brain. Like there's no research base to support this. We're going to talk a little bit later about actual trauma responses and stress in children. I'm not trying to like override that at all, because that's something different, right? When we see these posts about like when you shouted at your child, you know, you've caused them like this irreparable damage. This is not talking about a toxic home environment. These posts are often like put in a way that really like incites our emotions when we are parents raising children in a good, healthy, well-balanced home. And yeah, especially with the parents I've worked with, like I see this thing coming up where they're really holding that they shouted at their child this one time and feeling like there's no coming back from that. Like it's done such a big harm because there's so many people putting all these posts on social media about like the dangers of shouting and how damaging it is. So I want you to just kind of, if this is you, if you shouted at your child, maybe it was today, kind of relax a little bit about that. We're not talking about like constant and continual. We're talking about like a rare occasion. I want you just to relax that hasn't necessarily harmed your child or delayed their development in any way. So before we get on to the three things that we do know from research actually does affect and delay children's development, I want to talk a little bit about why child development is so important. As adults, we know that there are like certain recommendations for us, right? We know that we're supposed to move our bodies every day, that we're supposed to drink 8 glasses of water, that we're supposed to exercise, I think I said that one, that we're supposed to eat well, we take our vitamins, like we know all of these general recommendations for ourselves. And we also have probably had some experience of feeling like, okay, if I don't drink enough water, I get a headache or I feel dehydrated, but I don't like perish, I don't die from not taking care of that need for myself. But when we can't kind of like compare that to the experience of children not getting their actual requirements for development, because we have already grown, we've already developed, like our muscles in our body have already reached their growth point, right? Our bones are kind of set on how tall we will be. But for our children, much of what is developing in them hasn't reached that plateau of growth. And so when we don't foster development, when there are things in our children's environment that actually delay or impede their development, what it means is that they never get to like reach their full potential. It's not the same as like this might be detrimental to how you feel today. It's going to be detrimental across their life cycle, across their entire lives. So when we talk about child development, I want you to break any ideas that you have that this is just like, okay, well, it wasn't such a big deal, like for right now or whatever. Child development, really what we do in these little years, in the first 5 years of life, 90% of our children's brain networks are formed. So these little years are incredibly, incredibly important across, who they will be when they're 15, 16, 18, 25, 35. So all that we are plowing into right now is really, really important. And it's not the same as just, if we don't care for our, as adults, basic needs for one day, this is not the same as impeding a child's development. So this period of our children's life is really important, and we want to, plow and give the best opportunity for our children that they can thrive and grow throughout their lifespan. We did talk a little bit about this difference with cause and association, but I want to just touch on it again because this is quite a big topic in research. There's a lot of research that kind of points towards what are best practices for raising children. So, for example, we know that reading to children is incredibly powerful. It is a best practice if we can. It's something we definitely want to do. And that children that are read to less, there's a gap between the amount of vocabulary that they have compared to children who are read to regularly. That kind of gap is a little bit different to saying this actually causes damage, right? Because what we're saying there is that there's a gap in terms of their educational abilities, but not necessarily their growth, like physical and developmental growth potential. So we are only talking about 3 things today that we know actually cause damage, like not doing these things or doing these things actually really, it's really damaging for children. Whereas there are a lot of things that we look at in research and we say, well, these are best practices. Like research has shown clearly that reading to your children is great for them. So if we have the ability, let's do it. We know that there's research about the types of toys, the amount of toys, the way that we set up our playroom, the way that we communicate with children, how we build their language and their vocabulary. There's so much research around those kind of best practices, but that's not really what we're talking about today. Today we're talking about the things that we want to make sure to avoid, or if we haven't been able to avoid them, to take them into serious consideration and really work towards working on those first, right? Because those are the big things, and these other things here, like reading, are a little bit smaller in terms of the grand picture of child development. So I hope that makes sense and that wasn't too wafty, but it's important for me that you have kind of a picture of priorities in your head, because when we are doing this incredibly, incredibly important work of raising children, it's very easy to fall into all of these little rabbit holes, right? Like you didn't choose the best vitamins, or you spoke in the wrong way, or, cocomelon is like drugs for your child's brain. And we fall into these rabbit holes without actually recognizing what research has said and where the really big things are about raising children. So I hope that makes sense. And now let's get into these 3 things that we know from research actually has for the entire life an impact on a child's development. And the first one is ACEs. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. And basically, there was a really groundbreaking study conducted in 1995 by the CDC, the Center of Disease Control, and CASA. And basically, what they were looking at in this study is the impact of toxic stress across the lifespan. And they used kind of 3 criteria to look at this. So they were looking at physical and emotional abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And if you are interested in looking at these specifically, you can find there's all kinds of assessments that you can find online. And it will kind of give you for yourself an understanding of what your ACEs are if you had any adverse childhood experiences. And the clincher, the thing that was most interesting from the study, is that a lot of people do. Actually, 2/3 of people have experienced adverse childhood experiences. So while it's really nice to live in this world where we pretend that the most important thing is if your child has once watched Cocomelon and that's like the make or break clincher of parenting, if we peel back the surface and look at the reality of how children are raised, how we were raised, because we're also within these kind of percentages, there's more important things to look at. So this really looks at the impact of toxic stress across the lifespan. And what it really found is that, yes, toxic stress in the early years is incredibly detrimental to physical health and mental health across a child's lifespan. So they found that children that have higher ACEs have, well, not children, they were studying really the adults and looking at like the history that the adults had experienced. But they found that people that had these adverse childhood experiences, or more of them, had a higher risk of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, depression, substance abuse, smoking, poor academic achievement, and earlier death, which I think is it's just incredible to really understand that. So I would encourage you, if you're wondering, what your own ACEs are, what your children's ACEs are, to kind of go back and do this assessment, because we understand that things like having a toxic home environment, where we're not just talking about shouting once at our child, but we're talking about our child being constantly exposed to marital disputes, or our child being exposed to emotional or physical abuse. These things are incredibly, incredibly damaging for our children. So that's the first one. The second one is delaying early intervention when we know that our child already has some kind of developmental delay. And now I know that this is a hard one for many parents. Even to hear this, it's really hard for many parents, because how I see it when I work with parents is that there's often, when we're not talking about disability, we're not talking about something that, we can tell by a chromosome difference, or we can tell very obviously by a difference in the way that our child is functioning, or by their appearance, that there's a disability or a difference. But when our child has a slight delay, so this might be the amount of words that they speak, this might be walking, this might be like social communication, things that are more subtle, can be so difficult for parents to kind of negotiate this. I see it as like this pendulum, right? When we swing between these things of everything's totally fine, we had a great week, somebody gave my child a compliment about something, and we feel good, we feel secure, we feel great, everything's fine. Pendulum, the ball has swung to this side, until like it swings to the other side, where we feel like everything has gone so wrong and we've like missed the mark on supporting our child's development, and this is like, it will never get better. And I see this happening with parents, for example, that they have noticed. I'll talk specifically about speech because it's such an obvious one for toddler parents, but they've noticed that their child isn't speaking as much. And this pendulum swings from like, it's fine, children will learn, somebody's hairdresser's sister child didn't speak until they were 2 and they're completely fine and they do great. It swings from this like extreme of everything's fine, don't worry, everything's fine, to the other side of like, this must be autism. And it could be autism, like it's not that autism isn't a real diagnosis, but it's like a really big switch, right? It's a really big, as a therapist, there's a really big difference that we'd say to, we have a mild delay in the amount of vocabulary that a child speaks, to it must be autism. And there's a long process that happens in between those things in a therapeutic sense, right? In terms of the amount of intervention and the things that are available for our children with these two things. And it's not only with speech, right? This can happen with things like behavior, where we're like, okay, they just need a little bit more boundaries, to like, this child needs to go to a therapeutic like thing about their behavior. So it's very easy for us to swing between these extremes. But the truth is that if we realize that our child hasn't met a milestone, and again, the milestone charts are linked below, and it's not just a small milestone, or the things surrounding the milestone are also kind of in question. So let me just explain that just slightly. So for example, when we're saying like we're worried about the amount of words spoken, we may also notice like that this is coming into social play, into kind of following through with instructions. Like we may notice this in many areas that are around speech and language. But if we, for example, notice that our child hasn't mastered going up and down steps yet, but actually they've never really had the exposure to steps, but all of their gross motor milestones and stuff are like on track and they're totally fine, that's kind of like an isolated concern, right? It's quite different to something that we're seeing like a cluster picture of this impacting different things. So if we have noticed that there is something that is kind of like a cluster picture, it might be very notable, it might be more nuanced and kind of something that you as the parent that spends the most time with them pick up more than other people that are around. But if we've noticed that already and we make the decision to leave it and to just stay on that one side of the pendulum, what happens is that we actually, if you think about a graph, right, a child that is speaking just a few words less than like what the milestone is when they are, say, 2 years old, their peers alongside them are growing exponentially. And if the child continues on the same growth trajectory that they already are on, there'll be a huge difference to where the peers are, right? If we see a child that is speaking, say, 5 words at age 2, which is pretty dramatically below the milestone, and then by age 3, they are speaking, say they doubled, say they're 10 words, 15 words, but their peers are now speaking in whole sentences. They are telling stories by age 3. So yeah, the gap becomes even bigger. So what this means is that our child is then kind of isolated in terms of the social interactions or the menu of ways to play, ways to interact, ways to learn that they have available to them. So early intervention is critical. It really is critical. If we kind of hold our child back by not allowing for a burst of early intervention to really support, and it doesn't have to be speech, of course, it can be any kind of area, we really do impact their development. We hold them back in terms of their potential for growth in this critical time of development. Okay, now the third thing that research really is pointing to damaging children's development is lack of movement. When we look at a child's body, like when we look at their x-rays, when we look at what is still forming, there is a lot that is still forming in their bodies. Their bodies are not the same as an adult's body. Their bones are still growing. Their muscles are still growing. I had a video recently where we looked at the x-rays of a hand and how it develops, and really like how much soft tissue is in the hand of a 1-year-old compared to a 10-year-old. Their visual development is still growing. Their processing skills, some of these skills are only fully being developed around age 16. So what this means for us is that, again, these little years really, really count. Like, it's not just that our children are born and they are like fully formed and they can do everything that we do. They need this period of nurturing, and movement is really, really critical inside of that puzzle. We need to be able to allow our children to move. And often when I say this, people think of it like, well, my child might not be sporty. And it's really, the sporty component is like such a tiny little speck in this whole picture. It's really not the picture. We know that children that aren't exposed enough to movement when they're younger, they are more likely to have osteoporosis when they're older. Children that don't move enough don't get to, work on their visual processing, so writing and reading become more difficult. The amount of layers that movement impacts for our children, we can't undervalue it. You may have heard me reference this book before. It's a really great one. It is called Balanced and Barefoot, and it's by Angela Hanscom. She's also a pediatric occupational therapist, and she basically looks at this thing that if you're a teacher or a therapist, you might have experienced this as well. There's like this kind of feeling amongst us in the last generation of feeling like we're kind of holding our breath to see what will be in the future, because we see in our children right now the huge difference from their development to what development was a generation ago. So Angela actually did an informal study on this. She went into classrooms and looked at children's core strength and their balance abilities, and found that only 1 in 12 children were meeting the same norms of children in the 1980s. So that is like a massive difference. One of the critical pieces to this puzzle to kind of supporting this generation of children so that they will be able to function like children in the 1980s, that they will have their full potential reached in terms of their development, comes back to allowing our children to move enough. So if you're kind of wondering what on earth that really means and how do we even start when it comes to movement, I have a whole playlist here linked on your screen now, and it walks through movement for young children and how we can really equip our children with this gift of movement so that it won't be that thing that doesn't let them reach their potential. It won't be damaging their development. And I will see you over there.